She was 7 years old the first time she killed someone. More precisely, she was 7 when she died killing someone. That's an important distinction, because that's exactly how it ended. The Archmage Council's blade pierced her chest, and in the same moment she burned his heart out with the last scraps of her power. They fell simultaneously. The throne room floor was marble and cold. She remembered that cold. She felt it again now. But this was the cold of hospital sheets, not marble. And the ceiling above her wasn't a throne room, but a shabby room with a crack in the plaster through which morning light was pushing its way in. Vera opened her eyes. "She's awake!" A voice, high and delighted, hit her like a bell. "Mom, she's awake!" A boy of about 9 burst into the room, round-faced, with ears that stuck out and a scrape on his chin. He hovered over her with an expression like he'd just discovered buried treasure. "You almost died," he announced, with an enthusiasm that didn't match the content of the statement at all. 3 days with fever. I thought you were going to die. I even bet Fat Mac that you would. Now I owe him 5 coppers. Vera slowly raised her hand. A small hand, short fingers, broken nails. A birthmark on the wrist shaped like a comma. She knew that birthmark. It had always been hers. So this is my body, she thought. My real body. Not what it became later. She tried to sit up. Her head swam. The boy immediately caught her under the shoulder with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Careful. The healer said you can't move too fast." "What year is it?" Vera asked. The boy blinked. "What?" "The year. What year is it?" 712th since the founding." He studied her with suspicion. "You sure you're okay? Maybe the fever didn't break?" 712th. Vera closed her eyes and slowly exhaled. 31 years ago. I came back 31 years. She was 6 again. In her past life, she died at 37.
In those 37 years, she managed quite a lot. Becoming an orphan at 6, a runaway at 8, an alchemist's apprentice at 10, a rebel at 20, and, almost, a savior of the world at 37. The almost was the crucial part, because the ending hadn't gone the way she'd planned. The Council of Archmages had ruled the Empire of Archon for 4 centuries. 7 people, each capable of erasing a city from the map single-handedly. 7 people who had decided the world belonged to them, and everyone else existed only as a resource. Vera spent 20 years gathering allies, finding ancient formulas, restoring what the Council had destroyed. And in the end, she made it to the throne room. 6 archmages lay dead. The 7th was faster. She remembered his face. Calm, almost sympathetic. Archmage Karen, the oldest of the council. He looked at her the way a teacher looks at a talented but overconfident student. "You almost made it," he said. "Another year, maybe 2, and you would have." Then his sword entered her chest. Then she gathered the last thing she had left, a fragment of power he somehow hadn't noticed, and burned out his heart. Then came the cold of marble, and then fever, hospital sheets, a boy with ears that stuck out. "You going to stare at the ceiling much longer?" the boy asked. "Mum made soup. If you don't eat it, she'll be upset." Vera looked at him. Brother. Daniel, who everyone called Danny. 3 years older than her. In her past life, he died when she was 8, burned with their house during a council raid. She hadn't been fast enough. She'd carried that her whole life. "Danny," she said. "What?" "Nothing." Vera reached out and took his hand. I just wanted to make sure you were real. The boy looked at his hand, then at her, then at his hand again. Fever definitely didn't break, he concluded. I'll go tell Mum. When he left, Vera was alone. She stared at her small hands and thought. 31 years.
I have 31 years to do everything right. Part 1. The Return. Their house stood at the edge of the lower market, the loudest and poorest district of Archon City. 3 rooms, creaking floors, a window that never quite closed, and the smell of cinnamon from Mom's baking that had soaked into the walls so thoroughly it seemed like it would never air out. Mom's name was Rita. She was a small woman with tired hands who laughed rarely, but when she did, so loudly the whole street could hear. In her past life, Vera could barely remember that laugh. She'd tried to remember, and couldn't. The face she remembered. The hands she remembered. The laugh? No. Now she heard it again, and something inside her tightened so hard it became difficult to breathe. "Soup's getting cold," said Rita, setting a bowl on the table. "Eat slowly. The healer said the stomach's weak after fever." "You should eat too," said Vera. Mom looked at her in surprise. "What?" "You haven't eaten yet. I heard you moving around the house since morning." Vera nodded toward the second bowl. "Sit next to me." Rita was quiet for several seconds. Then she smiled, quietly, a little bewildered, and sat down. Danny, chewing bread in the corner, stared at his sister. "You're different," he announced. "Danielle," Mom warned. "No, really. Before she never said, 'Sit next to me.' Before she never said anything unless you asked her." Vera looked at her brother. In her past life, she had been a quiet child, frightened, closed off, unable to ask for help. That quality had later turned into strength. She'd learned to get by without people, to act alone, to trust no one. That quality had ultimately gotten her killed. "I changed," she said simply. "Fever does that sometimes." Danny narrowed his eyes. "That's not scientific. Have you read medical treatises?" "No, but—" "Then don't argue." Mom laughed again. Vera memorized the sound. The alchemical ranking system in the Empire of Archon worked like this.
Rank Copper, an apprentice capable of mixing basic preparations from ready-made components. Most people stopped here. Rank Iron, a practitioner who understood the principles of reactions and could work without recipes. Common enough to staff pharmacies and small workshops. Rank Silver, a master able to create components from scratch and modify existing formulas. These were valued. Even city guards knew better than to provoke them. Rank Gold, an alchemist capable of working with the primordial matter directly. Fewer than 20 were alive at any given time. Rank Archmage, 7. Members of the Council. Gods wearing human faces. In her past life, Vera reached gold at 24, a record that had stood for 200 years. In this life, she intended to do it faster. But first she needed to survive to age 8. The problem with returning to the past is that you remember what's supposed to happen, but you don't remember exactly when. The raid was somewhere between her 6th and 8th birthday. She remembered. Winter, snow, shouting in the street. Danny yelling something at her. She was running. Then fire. She was 6 now, which meant she had less than 2 years. The first thing she did was count money. The family wasn't wealthy. Mom worked at a bakery in the lower market. Father, Vera barely remembered him, had left when she was 3. There was enough money for food and rent, with almost nothing left over. This had to change. Vera sat at the table pretending to draw and thought.
At 6 years old, she had no access to alchemical reagents, but she had a head full of 30 years of accumulated knowledge, and hands that, small and weak as they were, belonged to her. She knew formulas, hundreds of formulas, thousands. The question was what she could make from what was already at hand. Vera stood, walked into the kitchen, and methodically examined every shelf. Flour, salt, sugar, vinegar, vegetable oil, dried mint, a desiccated bay leaf, mustard powder, an old tin can containing something that had once been honey. She picked up the can and smelled it. Fermented honey, approximately 3 years aged, contains volatile acids and specific esters. In her past life, she'd spent a year learning to determine a substance's composition by smell. It was the first lesson old alchemist Boris gave her in his cluttered workshop. Boris. She remembered him, heavy-set, perpetually irritated, with a purple stain on his left cheek from an explosion long ago. He'd taken her on as an apprentice out of pity and resented himself for it until the end of his life. And taught her anyway, every single day. In this life, she would find him sooner. But first, money. "What are you doing?" Danny stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Working," said Vera without looking up. "You're mixing Mom's vinegar with the honey." "Observant." "That'll ruin the honey." "No." Vera carefully added a pinch of salt and gently rocked the jar. "This will create a honey vinegar concentrate. In 3 days it'll be ready. It can be sold to the apothecary on Fish Street. These things are used for joint pain." Danny was quiet for a few seconds. "You know this from where?" Vera looked up at her brother. "Careful," she reminded herself. "You're a 6-year-old child. 6-year-olds don't know about honey vinegar concentrates." "I heard the apothecary on the market talking to a customer," she said. "He said a mixture like that is expensive to buy, but simple to make." I remembered. Danny looked at her like someone trying to solve a difficult problem. "You're very strange," he finally said. "I know. But fine." He came into the kitchen and sat beside her. "What should I do?" Vera looked at him. "In my past life, I never asked for help," she thought. Maybe that was the mistake all along. "Hold the jar level," she said, "and don't tilt it." The concentrate was ready in 4 days, 1 day later than she'd estimated, because the room temperature turned out to be lower than optimal. The apothecary on Fish Street, an older man with clever eyes, examined the jar with suspicion. "You made this yourself?" "Yes." "How old are you?" "6." A pause. "And where did you learn?" "I listened to smart people." The apothecary smelled the concentrate, tested a tiny drop on his tongue, frowned. 8 coppers, he said. 12, Vera replied. "You're joking." "You already know Greengan sells the same product for 15. Mine is better. I used 3-year honey, not last season's. The fermentation is deeper. The effect lasts longer." The apothecary stared at her for a long time. 10, he said at last. 11, and I'll come every week." They shook on it. Vera walked home with 11 coppers in her fist and felt something she had long forgotten how to feel in her past life. Hope. Danny was waiting at the gate. "How much?" he asked immediately. 11. He let out a low whistle. "Mom earns 12 in a whole day." "I know. That's why we need to make more." Danny looked at her for a long moment. "Vera," he said finally, "are you actually okay?" "No," she answered honestly. "But that doesn't matter. Something else does." "What?" She looked at him, at his ears that stuck out, and the scrape on his chin that was almost healed. at his round face where everything showed plainly. Surprise, skepticism, something that looked almost like admiration. In my past life, you died when I was 8. I wasn't fast enough. You were shouting something at me and I couldn't hear what it was. In this life, I'll hear it. We need to leave the lower market, she said. Before winter. Danny's mouth opened. That's a pretty big statement for a 6-year-old. Before winter, she repeated. Trust me. Old Boris lived on Coppersmith Street, in a house that looked like it could collapse at any moment, but somehow hadn't in about 50 years. There was no sign above the door, only a symbol burned into the wood. 2 crossed retorts. Vera stood before that door and thought. In her past life, she'd come to him in desperation, dirty and hungry, after 2 years on the streets. He'd opened the door, looked at her, said, "Another stray," and tried to close it again. She'd wedged her foot in the gap and told him she could fix his distillation cube. She'd seen it was cracked at the upper joint, through a gap in the shutters. He'd gone still, then let her in. Now she was 6 years old. She had no dirt, no desperation, and she was no stray. But she had 30 years of knowledge and 18 coppers, earned over the past 2 weeks. She knocked. A long silence. Then footsteps, heavy, annoyed. The door opened. Boris was exactly as she remembered him. Large, shaggy, with a purple stain on his cheek, and the expression of a man who'd been woken at the worst possible moment. He looked down at her. "I don't need cookies," he said. "Or newspaper subscriptions either." "Your distillation cube is cracked," said Vera. "Upper chamber, at the joint with the condenser. The crack is small, but it widens under heat, and you're losing approximately 7% of your yield." A pause. Boris slowly looked at his window, then at her. "How do you know about the cube?" "I saw it through the shutters." "The shutters are closed." "Not entirely. The left hinge has worked loose." A long pause. "How old are you?" 6. "And what do you want?" Vera straightened up. "I want to learn," she said. "I have 18 coppers. That's not payment for lessons. I understand it's not enough. It's an advance on my first month of work. I'll clean, carry, scrub retorts, do whatever you say. In exchange, you let me watch. Just watch. That's all I'm asking." Boris stared at her. "You're a strange child," he said at last. "I know." "Just watch. What does that mean exactly?" "Silently, without getting in the way, only watching what you do." Boris scratched the back of his head. "Show me your hands." She held them out. He examined her palms, carefully, the way someone inspects a tool before purchase. "Good hands," he muttered. "Fingers are straight. Grip's probably weak, but that's fixable." He stepped back from the door. "Come in. We'll see what you're worth." What she was worth became apparent fairly quickly. On the first day, she cleaned the workshop, methodically, without touching anything marked or sitting on work surfaces, arranging everything else in an order that Boris later studied with a suspicious look, unable to figure out exactly what had changed, but feeling that it was better. On the second day, he asked her to bring the red reagent on the lower shelf to the left. She brought it. On the way back, she said, "The label says carmine extract, first purification, but the smell indicates the purification was incomplete. Roughly 3% impurities remain." Boris stopped mid-motion and slowly turned. "Say that again?" She said it again. "You smelled the reagent?" "Yes." "And where did you learn about incomplete purification?" A pause. Vera quickly weighed her options.
I smelled a clean carmine extract at a market stall once. The smell was different.
Boris stared at her for a long moment.
Which stall? Fish Street, third counter from the corner. But he dilutes fresh batches with old stock, so it's better to buy from him only on odd-numbered days. That's when he's just received a shipment.
A long pause. How old are you? Boris asked again.
6. And you just smell reagents at market stalls? I walk around the market a lot, said Vera carefully. People say interesting things.
Boris was quiet for a long time. Then he turned away and muttered something under his breath, from which Vera caught only abnormal and my life was simpler before. But he didn't send her away. 3 weeks passed. Vera came every day after walking Danny to school. She cleaned, she carried, she scrubbed retorts, a task that had previously taken Boris nearly an hour every evening, which he'd always done with visible reluctance. She did it in 20 minutes, because she knew exactly which solution to use for each type of glassware. She just watched. Boris, of course, understood perfectly well that she wasn't just watching. But he said nothing, only sometimes turning around to find her gaze locked on his hands and muttering something unintelligible. On the 23rd day, he broke a distillation tube, simply dropped it, in a rush onto cold stone. A crack. Boris froze, then slowly exhaled through his teeth. "Damn it all," he said.
"I can fix it," said Vera.
"You don't fix glass."
"Alchemical glass, you do, if the break is clean."
She came over and examined the tube.
3 centimeters here. You'd need silicate flux and a controlled heat application. Do you have a soldering torch?
Boris looked at her. "You'll know how to use a torch?"
"No, but you do. I'll tell you what to do."
A long pause. "You're saying a 6-year-old child is going to tell me what to do?"
"Just this once."
Boris made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a grunt, then got out the torch. 20 minutes later, the tube was as good as new. Better, perhaps. The flux in the precisely calibrated quantity had strengthened the glass at the point of the break. Boris held the tube up to the light and was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Come an hour earlier tomorrow." Vera nodded. "And bring a notebook," he added. "We're going to start writing things down." Danny was waiting at the gate. It was getting dark already, and he'd clearly been worried, though he was trying to hide it.
"You're late again," he said. "Sorry. Mom was asking. I'll talk to her."
They walked through the evening lower market, past closing shops, past a woman selling roasted chestnuts, past boys playing dice against a wall.
"Vera,"
said Danny.
"Yeah?"
"That old alchemist, is he normal?"
Vera considered.
"No," she said, "but he's good." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Are you safe there?"
"In my past life, no one ever asked me that," thought Vera. "Not once. Not ever. Not a single person in 37 years. "Yes," she said, "I'm safe." Danny nodded and took her hand. Just like that, without words. Vera stared straight ahead and thought about how in her past life she'd never allowed herself this. Someone else's hand, warmth, a simple, "Are you safe?" She'd thought it was weakness. Now she knew it was strength. The exact kind she hadn't had enough of at the end. Winter came earlier than she expected. The first snow fell in mid-October. Light, almost unreal, melted by noon. But Vera felt the cold and remembered.
There had been snow. At night. Danny had been shouting. She didn't know the exact date, still didn't remember, even now, but she knew she was running out of time. In Boris's workshop, she was working properly now, not just watching, but genuinely helping. The old alchemist pretended this was simply how things were, and never said aloud that he was teaching her. But he was teaching her. Every single day. "Why don't you apply to the academy?" he asked one afternoon, not looking up from his work. "I'm 6 years old." "They accept from 8. 2 years from now. Perfect timing." Vera didn't answer right away. The Arcan Academy, the Empire's premier institution, founded by the Council itself. 4 years of study, after which a graduate received the rank Iron and a place in the system. The best went further, into mastery, into the Council's own ranks eventually. In her past life, she had never attended the academy. She'd been on the streets at 8. By the time she found Boris, she was 2 years behind where academy students started, and she'd spent years catching up on her own terms, learning things no academy syllabus would ever include. Things like how to make a poison that mimicked natural death, how to dissolve alchemical seals that weren't supposed to be dissolvable, how to compress 5 days of a reaction into 6 hours when you had no choice. The academy taught you to be useful to the system. Boris had taught her, eventually, to survive outside it. "Maybe," she said. Boris looked up at her, just briefly, then looked back down. "The academy has resources," he said. "Equipment you won't find anywhere else. And contacts." He paused. "Having the right contacts is worth more than having the right answers." "You didn't go to the academy," Vera said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "And I've regretted it exactly twice in my life. Both times I needed something I could have gotten easily if I'd known the right people." Vera filed this away. In her past life, she had assembled her network of allies over 15 years through sheer necessity. People who owed her, people who feared her, people who simply believed in what she was trying to do. It had taken too long. She'd arrived at the throne room with 6 dead archmages and not quite enough left to finish the job. If she'd started building connections at 8 instead of 22... "I'll think about it," she said. Boris made a non-committal sound and went back to his work. The raid happened on a Tuesday. She knew it was a Tuesday because the market had been loud that morning. Tuesdays were delivery days in the lower market, and the street outside their window had been full of the sounds of crates being unloaded and vendors arguing. She'd woken up with that sound and lain still, listening, running calculations. She'd had a feeling for 3 days, a tightness in her chest that she recognized but couldn't name. In her past life, she'd called it instinct and learned to trust it absolutely. She'd already moved most of what mattered. Over the past 2 months, she and Danny had quietly shifted their small savings to a location that wasn't the house. She'd memorized the safest route out of the lower market. 3 options, depending on which streets were blocked. She'd told Danny that if anything bad ever happened, anything at all, they should run to the Coppersmith Street and go to the house with the burned wood sign. She hadn't told him why. She hadn't told him she'd been planning this for months. She'd just told him to remember. The sound started at midnight. Not shouting, not at first. Just a low rumble that didn't belong. The kind of sound that comes from many people moving together in the dark. Vera was awake instantly. She was across the hall and had Danny by the shoulder before the first shout went up from 3 streets over. "What?" he started. "Don't talk," she said quietly. "Get dressed. Take only what fits in your pockets. Go." "Vera, what's happening?" "Raiders." She said it calmly, the way she said everything now, without panic, without hesitation, with the authority of someone who had lived through this before. "The Council's men. They're sweeping the lower market. We need to leave. Right now. Danny looked at her. In the years since her return, she'd watched him slowly adjust to who she had become. The way she spoke, the things she knew, the certainty she carried. He'd stopped asking where she learned things. He'd started, instead, simply following her when she moved with that particular kind of purpose. He got dressed without another word. They were out of the house in 4 minutes. She took the middle route, the one that went through the alley behind the old tannery, which smelled terrible, but was wide enough to run through and connected to Coppersmith Street on the far end. She heard shouting behind them and didn't look back. She heard something heavy fall and shatter and still didn't look back. She kept Danny's hand in hers and ran. The Coppersmith Street was quiet when they arrived. The house with the burned wood sign was dark. Vera knocked, 3 short, 1 long, and waited. Light appeared in the window. Steps. The door opened. Boris looked at them, at Danny gasping behind her, at the sounds still echoing from the direction of the lower market. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened the door wider and said, "Come in." He asked no questions. The lower market burned for 6 hours. In the morning, they stood on Coppersmith Street and looked at the smoke rising over the rooftops. Danny's face was very still. He was 9 years old, and he was learning, in real time, what the world they lived in actually was. "Our house," he said. "Gone," said Vera. "Mom's things. Everything." "I know." He turned to look at her. His face was doing something complicated. Grief and shock, and beneath both of those, something that looked like anger taking its first shape. "You knew this was going to happen," he said. It wasn't a question. Vera was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "How?" "I've known for a while that the council has been moving through the lower districts. They do it every few years. They call it sanitation, clearing out anyone they consider unregistered or unaffiliated." She kept her voice level. "I started preparing 2 months ago." Danny stared at her. "You're 6 years old," he said. "I know." "Vera!" He took a step toward her. His voice had gone very quiet. "Who are you?" The question hung between them. She looked at her brother, at his face that showed everything, at the grief and shock and the anger still forming, and thought about what to say. She had prepared for this moment, too. She had several versions of a plausible answer ready, several ways to deflect, to redirect, to give him just enough to satisfy without giving him the full weight of something he wasn't ready for. She opened her mouth and said, "I don't know yet, but I'm figuring it out." Danny looked at her for a long time. "Is that actually true?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "But it will be." He was quiet. Then he exhaled, a long, shaky breath, and rubbed his face with both hands. "Okay," he said. "Okay." Another breath. "What do we do now?" Vera looked back at the smoke. "Now," she said, "we start." Part 2. The First Year. Boris had 2 spare rooms. He also had approximately 40 years of accumulated junk, 3 cats of uncertain temperament, and an aversion to house guests that he expressed by pretending he had no aversion whatsoever while leaving passive obstacles in the way. The first night Vera moved a stack of old journals that had been placed, not quite accidentally, across the threshold of the spare room. The second morning she found the cats had colonized Danny's blanket. She relocated them with the calm efficiency of someone who dealt with worse, and said nothing. Boris watched all of this with the expression of a man who was waiting to be impressed and wasn't ready to admit it yet. "How long do you need to stay?" he asked on the third morning. "Long enough," said Vera. "That's not an answer." "I know. I'll have a better one when I have more information." Boris stared at her over his tea. "What kind of information?" "Whether the council is done with the lower market, or whether they'll move further. Whether we can eventually go back. Whether—" She paused. "Whether our mother made it out." She said the last part carefully, keeping her voice even. In her past life, she hadn't known what happened to her mother. The house had burned. She and Danny had run. They'd been separated a week later when a second sweep came through, and Danny had pushed her in one direction and gone himself in another. She'd spent 6 months looking for him. She'd never found him. She'd spent 6 months after that trying not to think about what that meant. In this life, she had gotten Danny out. She didn't know yet about Mom. "Do you have people in the lower market?" she asked Boris. "Why?" "Information costs less than searching yourself. If someone you know heard anything about who got out."
"You're asking me to gather intelligence," Boris said flatly. "You're 6.
"Almost 7, said Vera. "And I'm asking because I need to know. And you have connections I don't have yet." "Yet," she said, and let the words sit there. Boris was quiet. He turned his teacup in his hands. The cats rearranged themselves on the windowsill. "I know someone," he said finally. "I'll ask." "Thank you," said Vera. "Don't thank me. I haven't found anything yet." He set down the cup. "And in the meantime," he stood, moving toward the workshop. "Come, you're going to stop watching and start doing." Vera had expected this moment. She'd thought about it many times, the first time Boris would hand her actual tools and actual materials and ask her to work. What she hadn't expected was how difficult it would be to pretend she didn't already know what she was doing. "This is a basic extraction," Boris said, setting up the equipment. "You take the raw material," he placed a bundle of dried roots on the work surface, "and you separate the useful compound from the inert matter. The principle is simple. Different substances respond to heat at different rates. If you control the temperature precisely enough, you can pull out exactly what you want without disturbing the rest," Vera said. Pause. "I was going to say that," Boris said. "Sorry." "Don't be sorry. Explain how you know it." Vera carefully constructed a memory she didn't have. "You explained it once," she said. "About 3 weeks ago. You were working on something and you said the principle out loud. I think to yourself. I was cleaning the far counter." Boris looked at her steadily. "I said it out loud?" "Yes." "While you were cleaning?" "You have a habit of thinking aloud when you work. It's actually very helpful for learning." A long pause. Boris's expression was unreadable in the particular way that meant he was deciding how much of this to believe. "Fine," he said at last. "If you already know the principle, show me the application." He stepped back from the equipment. Vera stepped forward. She did what she would have done in her past life, which was to work correctly, but slowly, deliberately, making small pauses that indicated thinking, small adjustments that indicated learning in real time. She got the temperature right on the 3rd try instead of the 1st, which was the absolute minimum level of error a genuine beginner could plausibly achieve. The extraction came out clean. She turned and set the vial on the counter. Boris picked it up, held it to the light, smelled it. "First attempt," he said. "3rd," she corrected. "The first 2 I had the heat too high." "I watched the first 2. Your adjustments were very precise for someone who said they were guessing." Vera said nothing. Boris set down the vial. "Vera," he said quietly. Yes? I've been teaching alchemists for 30 years. The fastest natural I ever trained reached this level at 14. He paused. You're 6. Almost 7. Yes. That's not possible. Clearly it is, she said carefully. I'm right here. Boris was quiet for a very long time. Long enough that Danny drifted in from the other room to see why no one was talking, took one look at the scene, and drifted back out with the instinct of someone who understood that something important was happening, and he wasn't part of it. Are you a prodigy? Boris asked finally. I don't know what I am, said Vera. I know what I want to be. That's enough for now. Boris made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite refusal. Then he said, Again. This time I want to see you fail properly. No controlled errors. Just try something you actually can't do yet. Vera almost smiled. I can do that, she said. Rita was alive. Boris heard it from his contact on the 5th day, a woman who sold produce near the market's eastern edge and had seen everything that happened. The council's sweep had taken 43 people from the lower market. Most had been taken for questioning about unregistered alchemical activity, which was the council's way of saying they'd heard rumors of underground formula trading and wanted to make an example. Rita had gotten out through the baker's back entrance with 3 other women, made it to the North Quarter, and was currently staying with a distant relative on Mill Wheel Lane. Boris told Vera this over dinner while Danny was washing dishes. Vera nodded. She was quiet for several seconds. Can you send her a message? She asked. Tell her we're safe. Tell her... She paused. Tell her we're with someone reliable, and she shouldn't worry. And then? Boris asked. Then I'd like to see her. But not yet. Vera looked at the table. She'll want us to come back. She'll have found some new place already, somewhere in the lower market or near it. She won't understand why that's not safe. Is it not safe? The council swept the lower market because of rumors about underground alchemical trade. Those rumors came from somewhere real. She met Boris's eyes. Whoever was running that trade is either captured or scattered now. But the council will have informants watching the area. Anyone they identify as connected to alchemical work, anyone who was near it, anyone who sold materials, anyone who bought from the wrong people, is at risk for the next year at least. Boris was quiet. Your mother was a baker, he said. She had no connection to... She's my mother, said Vera. And I work for an alchemist. If someone informs the council that a child from the lower market has been apprenticed to an independent alchemist on Coppersmith Street... She stopped. Boris let out a slow breath. You've thought about this a lot, he said. I think about most things a lot. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you said not yet. When? When it's safer. 6 months, maybe. The council's attention will move by then. She looked at her hands. I just need her to know we're alive. Boris studied her face for a long moment. You're 6 years old, he said, not for the first time, but with a different weight than before. Not disbelief. Something more like wonder. Or grief. I know, said Vera quietly. He sent the message. Danny found her that night, sitting on the workshop floor in the dark. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting, her back against the cold stone wall, looking at nothing. He sat down beside her without asking. For a while, neither of them said anything. Somewhere in the house, one of the cats knocked something over and made no apology for it. She's okay, Danny said. Yes, We'll see her. Yes, soon. He leaned his head back against the wall. Vera, he said, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer. She looked at him. Did you know this was going to happen? He meant the raid, the sweep, their house. Not that it might happen. Did you know it would? A long pause. Yes, she said. How long did you know? Since I woke up from the fever. Since the beginning. Danny was quiet for a long time. The single candle left burning in the far corner threw unsteady shadows. So, when you started making the concentrate, he said, when you made me hold the jar level. Yes. And when you started going to the old man. Yes. You were already planning. Yes. He exhaled. Vera, his voice was very careful. How did you know? She thought about what to say. She'd had this conversation in her head 100 times. She'd prepared answers for it, partial truths that wouldn't require explaining the impossible, ways to redirect, ways to seem like a strange but talented child rather than a dead woman who'd been returned to the beginning of her life. But this was Danny, who had died because she wasn't fast enough, who had taken her hand at the gate without being asked,
Who had sat down beside her in the dark without asking why. I don't know how to explain it, she said finally. But I remember things I shouldn't remember. I know things I shouldn't know. And everything I know tells me that the next few years are going to be very dangerous. For us. For a lot of people. Danny was quiet. The council, he said. Yes. They're behind all of it. Yes. He nodded, slowly, like someone settling a weight across his shoulders and accepting it. Then what do we do? He asked. We learn, said Vera. We prepare. We get strong enough that when the time comes, we're ready. Ready for what? She looked at the workshop around them, the shelves of reagents, the cold glass equipment, the accumulated knowledge of 30 years of alchemy sitting in jars and bottles and worn leather notebooks. To take them apart, she said simply. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded again. Okay, he said. Show me what I can do. Part 3. The Academy. 2 years later. Vera stood at the gate of the Arcan Academy on the morning of the entrance examinations and felt nothing she would have expected to feel. She was 8 years old, nearly 9. She was taller than she'd been, though still small for her age, and her hands were marked with the faint chemical stains that never quite washed out, no matter how carefully she cleaned them. She had the rank of copper, officially, because she'd registered 3 months ago at Boris's insistence. She was unofficially somewhere between silver and gold in terms of actual capability, a fact she intended to keep between herself and the reagent shelves for as long as possible. Danny stood beside her. He was 11, and in 2 years he'd grown into something that looked more like a person and less like a collection of sharp angles. He'd spent those 2 years working in Boris's workshop, not as an alchemist apprentice, because his aptitude was clearly elsewhere, but as a supplier, a runner, someone who knew everyone in the market and could find anything at a reasonable price within a day. He had contacts now, more than she'd expected. He'd turned out, against all predictions, to be very good at people. You don't have to look like you're going to war, he said. I don't look like I'm going to war. You have the face. What face? The one you get when you're about to do something that matters. He studied her. It's a good face. A bit scary, honestly, but good. Vera almost smiled.
The academy examination was 2 days. The first day, written tests on alchemical principles, materials identification, reaction theory. The second day, practical application under observation. She had debated for months how much to show. Too little, and she wouldn't get in. She needed to get in. The academy had resources she couldn't access anywhere else, connections that would take her a decade to build organically, and access to the council's own research archives, which were technically restricted to registered academy students and graduates. Too much, and she became a curiosity. A prodigy to be examined, monitored, potentially brought to the council's attention before she was ready for them to know she existed. She'd settled on a range, strong enough to earn a placement in the advanced track, not so strong that anyone wrote a report about her to send upward. The gates opened. "Go be terrifying," said Danny, in a subtle way. She went. The first day was easy. She paced herself against the room's best students. There were 30 applicants for 8 spots in the advanced program, and stayed just ahead of the curve without pulling away from it.
The proctor, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, watched the room move through the written examination with the bored efficiency of someone who'd done this 60 times. He looked at Vera twice. She noticed both times and adjusted accordingly. Materials identification was the section she had to be most careful with. She correctly identified everything. 63 samples, rare and common, from basic salt compounds to 3 reagents she recognized as restricted substances that an 8-year-old realistically should not have encountered. For those 3, she wrote, unclear, unfamiliar compound, suspected, general category, requires further analysis. It was the most elaborate lying she'd done in a while, which was saying something. At the end of the first day, a girl sat down next to her. "You're from the lower market," she said. Vera looked at her. The girl was about her age, maybe slightly older, with a composed face and very steady hands resting flat on the table in a posture that someone had taught her. Dark hair pulled back precisely, uniform that fit too well to be anything but expensive. "I was," said Vera. "The sweep 2 years ago." "Yes." "I'm sorry," the girl said. And then, with the directness of someone who didn't particularly traffic in social pleasantries, "My name is Sylvie. My father is a senior researcher in the council's materials division. I'm expected to pass this examination with the highest score in the cohort." Vera studied her. "And you're telling me this because—" "Because you're going to get the highest score," Sylvie said. "And I thought you should know that I know that, and that it doesn't bother me." A pause. "My father would find it much more useful to have someone genuinely capable in my cohort than to have me ranked first among mediocre people." Vera was quiet for a moment. "You're 8 years old," she said. "Almost 9. And your father taught you to assess competition and make alliances before the first day of examinations was over." Sylvie's expression didn't change. "He taught me to recognize useful people and not waste time being jealous of them. The assessment was mine." Vera looked at her hands, at the faint chemical stains, at the scrape on her right index finger from where she'd misjudged an edge last week. "In my past life," she thought, "I spent 20 years building a network alone, person by person, slowly, through necessity. What if I started sooner?" "Tomorrow is practical," said Vera. "Yes." "What's your strongest area?" Sylvie blinked. Just once. The first crack in the composed facade, like she'd expected something else, an argument, maybe, or a brush-off. "Synthesis," she said. "Construction. Building complex compounds from components." "Mine is analysis," said Vera, which was true as far as it went, and also neatly complementary.
Different approaches to the same problems. Sylvie looked at her for a moment. They seat us separately for the practical, she said. No collaboration allowed. Obviously, I wasn't suggesting collaboration. Vera stood, gathering her things. I was suggesting that knowing what you're good at might be useful. For later. She walked out. Behind her, she heard Sylvie make a small sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite surprise. Something in between. She passed the examination in second place overall. First place went to Sylvie, who turned out to be every bit as competent as she'd assessed herself to be. Her synthesis work on day 2 was technically excellent, precise, and elegant. Vera's practical had been good, very good, but she'd made 3 choices that cost her points. Deliberate hesitations that read as uncertainty, a slower than necessary approach to the open-ended final problem, a conclusion that was correct, but arrived at by a route more cautious than necessary. The proctor's report, which she saw later, there were channels if you knew where to look, noted that candidate V, aged 8, demonstrated exceptional analytical instinct and unusual methodological care for her age, with possible untapped potential if developed. Possible untapped potential. She'd worked very hard for that phrasing. The advanced track had 8 students. Sylvie, Vera, a boy named Marcus who moved like he was always trying to take up less space and turned out to have a nearly supernatural sensitivity to reaction timing. A tall girl named Elena, whose family owned the largest reagent supply operation in the city's upper districts. 2 brothers, Fen and Kale, who competed with each other constantly and worked together brilliantly when forced to. A quiet student named Oren, who never said anything unless it mattered. And a girl whose name turned out to be Leah, who had been brought to the academy on a scholarship from the lower districts, and who looked, on the first day, like she was waiting for someone to tell her there'd been a mistake. Vera knew that look. She'd worn it herself once. Briefly, before she'd stopped allowing herself to feel like a mistake and started working. She sat next to Leah on the first morning. "You're from the west side," Leah said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Near Coppersmith Street. For the past 2 years. Before that, the lower market." Leah looked at her properly then. "The sweep." "Yes." Something shifted in Leah's expression. Not sympathy, exactly. Recognition. "East side," she said. "Mine was 4 years ago. Different reason." She paused. "Council's men came through looking for unregistered practitioners. My uncle was one. He got away, but we lost the house." "I'm sorry," said Vera. "He's okay. He's in the outer city now." Leah looked at the room around them, the long workbenches, the equipment gleaming under high windows, things that cost more than most families in the lower districts saw in a year. "This is strange," she said quietly. "Being here?" "Yes," said Vera. "It is. Do you think we belong here?" Vera thought about this carefully. "I think the question of belonging is less important than the question of what we do with the time we have here," she said. "And I think you're here because you earned it. Both of those things are true at once." Leah was quiet for a moment. "You're very strange," she said. "I've heard that before," said Vera. "I've stopped arguing with it." Leah almost smiled. The academy had 3 instructors for the advanced track. Maestra Vance handled theory, a brisk woman in her 50s who taught the way she breathed, without apparent effort, filling the room with information at a speed that left most students scrambling. Vera had read most of what Maestra Vance taught in Boris's notebooks, but she appreciated the rigor. It organized things she'd learned instinctively into frameworks she could use more precisely. Master Dolan handled practical application, a quiet man who watched more than he talked, and had a way of appearing at your elbow exactly when you were about to make an interesting mistake. He never stopped the mistake. He let it happen. Then he asked you to explain exactly what had gone wrong and why, and whether you'd seen it coming. The third instructor was someone she hadn't expected. His name was Rowan. He was young for an instructor, perhaps 25, with calloused hands and a scar on his left forearm that she recognized as a chemical burn, poorly treated. He taught what the academy called applied contexts, which meant, in practice, how alchemy worked in the real world rather than in controlled conditions. Under stress, with incomplete materials, when the formula you needed wasn't available and you had to construct something from what was on hand. He was, she realized immediately, not a councilman. He taught like someone who had learned what he knew outside, the same way she had in her past life, in places where you used what was available and improvised the rest. There was a roughness to his methodology that didn't fit the academy's careful aesthetic. She watched him for 2 weeks before she said anything directly. "The substitution you demonstrated on Tuesday," she said, after class, while the other students were leaving. "For the thermal stabilizer." He turned to look at her. "Carrick's extract isn't always available," she continued, "especially in field conditions. You used brinewort oil as a substitute. That's not in any standard formula. Where did you learn that?" Rowan studied her. "Where did you learn that it's not in any standard formula?" he asked. She paused. "I've read most of the standard formula archives," she said. "You're 8 years old." "I read quickly." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The substitution was something I worked out myself. A few years ago, when I was working in the northern provinces, there was an outbreak of red fever and the supply lines were cut. We had brinewort in abundance and nothing else that would work. There are 3 other substitutes that would have functioned," Vera said, "depending on what you had available. Brinewort is the best option if temperature stability is the priority. If shelf life matters more—" "Who are you?" Rowan asked. Not rudely, just directly, with genuine curiosity. Vera looked at him. In her past life, she had met exactly 3 people who looked at her that way, like they were actually asking the question instead of waiting for an answer that would fit what they already thought. Boris was one of them. Danny was another. "I'm trying to figure that out," she said. "But I think maybe we have similar ideas about how alchemy actually works versus how it's supposed to work." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. "Come to my office hours on Thursday," he said finally.
Bring your notebooks.
"I have a lot of notebooks." "Bring the interesting ones." Spring arrived, and with it 2 things she hadn't planned for. The first was a message from the council. Not addressed to her, addressed to Boris, formally, on heavy paper with an official seal, requesting that the alchemist on record at the Coppersmith Street address provide documentation regarding any apprentices currently in his employ, their ages, registration status, and general aptitude assessment, for the purposes of the council's ongoing talent identification initiative. Boris showed it to her without expression. She read it twice, turned it over, checked the seal. It was real. "This is routine," she said carefully. "They do this every 2 years, cross-referencing academy enrollment against independent apprenticeships." "Is it routine?" Boris asked. "Usually." She set the paper down. "But the timing—" "Is also routine," he said. "Spring enrollment cycle." "Yes." They looked at each other. "I'll respond accurately," said Boris. "1 apprentice, age 8, nearly 9. Registered as copper rank 3 months ago. Enrolled at the academy. Aptitude—" He paused. "How would you like me to describe your aptitude?" "Promising," said Vera, "with strong foundational instincts and significant room for growth." Boris almost smiled. "Promising,
he agreed, with room for growth. The second thing was harder to plan for. The second thing was Sylvie. They had fallen into a pattern over the first months of the academy. Not quite a friendship, which seemed too loose a word for something so deliberate and mutually calculated, but something that functioned like one. They studied together twice a week. They argued about methodology in a way that consistently produced better results for both of them. Sylvie was meticulous in ways Vera sometimes wasn't. She caught procedural errors that Vera's instinct-first approach occasionally produced.
Vera caught conceptual gaps that Sylvie's precisely trained mind sometimes moved past too quickly. It was useful. It was also, somewhere under the utility, something else. Something Vera was less practiced at naming. One afternoon, 3 months into the academy term, Sylvie put down her pen and said, "My father asked about you." Vera went still. "What did he ask?" "He wanted to know who you were, where you came from, whether your results were consistent with what the proctor's report said." Sylvie's voice was perfectly even. "I told him you were from the lower market, that you'd apprenticed with an independent alchemist, that your practical results were strong." "And?" "And he said he'd like to meet you." She paused. "I'm telling you in advance, because I thought you should have time to think about whether you want that." Vera looked at her. "Your father works directly under the council," she said. "Yes. Meeting him is not a neutral act." "No." Sylvie met her eyes steadily. "It's not. And I'm not going to pretend it is, or try to minimize what that means. I'm telling you because—" She paused, and for just a moment the composed facade showed something underneath it. Something that was, Vera thought, closer to real than anything Sylvie had shown her before. "Because you've been honest with me, in a way that's not actually common in this place, and it seemed like the fair thing to do." Vera was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her past life, about 20 years of fighting the council and the things it had done, about Sylvie's father, whose name she didn't know yet, but whose role she understood, a researcher inside the system, building the knowledge the council used. She thought about what it meant to have access to that, to have someone inside who knew her. She thought about what it meant to have someone who chose to warn her. "Thank you," she said. "So you won't meet him." "I didn't say that." Vera picked up her pen again. "I said thank you."
"I need to think about it." Sylvie nodded, picked up her own pen. "Okay," she said simply, and went back to work. That evening, Vera sat on the floor of Boris's workshop, her spot, the one against the cold stone wall, and laid out what she knew. The council. 31 years until her original death. She was 8. She had 29 years. In her past life, she had spent 15 of those years just building the foundation, the allies, the knowledge, the access, the resources to mount any kind of serious challenge. She'd done it alone, in secret, always a step behind, always reacting. She'd arrived at the throne room one step short. If she started now, if she used the academy, used the connections it offered, used Sylvie and her father and Rowan, who was clearly not a council loyalist, and Leah, who had her own reasons, and Danny, who could talk to anyone, if she built the network now, while she was still below anyone's notice, 29 years was a long time. She thought about Karen's face. "You almost made it," he'd said. "Another year, maybe 2. She had 29. "You're making plans," said Danny from the doorway. She looked up. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, looking at her with an expression she recognized, the one he got when he'd been watching her for a while and had come to some conclusion.
Yes, she said. Big ones. Yes. He came in and sat across from her. The cats redistributed themselves around them with proprietary calm. Tell me, he said. She looked at her brother, 9 years old, almost 10, with his ears still sticking out and the scrape on his chin long since healed and replaced with a different one from a different adventure. He'd spent 2 years learning that the world was larger and more dangerous and more interesting than the lower market. And he'd absorbed that knowledge with the same directness he brought to everything. She had kept things from him. Pieces, the shape of what she knew, without the depth of it. But he'd sat with her in the dark and asked what he could do. He'd taken her hand at the gate. He'd learned, slowly, to follow her when she moved with purpose. The thing I got wrong, she thought, wasn't the plan, wasn't the knowledge, wasn't even the timing. It was doing it alone. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and it's going to sound impossible. And I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything. Danny looked at her steadily. Okay, he said. Vera took a breath, and for the first time in 8 years, 2 lives, she started from the beginning. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. The cats had fallen asleep. Somewhere in the house, Boris was moving around, the familiar evening sounds of his routine. The candle had burned down by a third. So you're 38 years old, Danny said finally. 37 when I died. 38 now in total years of consciousness. I think. The math is complicated. And the council killed you. Eventually, yes. And you came back. Apparently. And you've been planning since you were 6. Yes. He was quiet again. The raid, he said. You knew exactly when. Within a month. I knew it was coming, not the precise night. That's why you moved the money and found Boris. Yes. And Mom, I got us out. I knew the route. She met his eyes. I tried, Danny. I tried as hard as I could to plan for all of it. He nodded slowly. You didn't tell me. I didn't know how to tell you. I still barely know, but She paused. I've been trying to do this alone. And in my past life, that's exactly what I did, and it wasn't enough. She looked at her hands. I'm trying to be different this time. Danny was quiet for a very long moment. Then he said, What do you need me to do? Vera looked up. He was watching her with that particular expression. Calm, direct, the one that meant he'd already decided and was just waiting for instructions.
You're not frightened, she said. I'm terrified, he corrected. But you've had a 37-year head start on being terrified, and you're still here. I figure I can manage. He uncrossed his arms. What do you need? She thought about the council, about Sylvie's father, about Rowan, who wasn't what he appeared, about Leah with her own reasons, about what it meant to build something over 29 years instead of trying to fight your way through a throne room door. I need you to keep being you, she said. You're good with people. You know how to find things, learn things, move through spaces without anyone paying attention. That's not a small thing. That's something I never learned. And I need you to trust me when I say something is dangerous. Not to argue. Not to ask for full explanations I can't always give. And? She paused. And I need you to tell me when I'm wrong, she said quietly. I've been wrong before. I've been wrong in ways that cost everything.
I need someone who'll say so. Danny looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. Not to shake, just open, palm up. The same way he'd reached for her at the gate 2 years ago, without words. She put her hand in his. Okay, he said. We do this together. The candle burned. The cat slept. Outside, Archon City went about its evening with no idea what was sitting in a small workshop on Coppersmith Street, making plans that would, in time, change everything. Vera looked at the reagent shelves, at the knowledge accumulated in jars and bottles and 30 years of careful study. 29 years, she thought. It was a long time. This time, it would be enough. End of Part 3. The story continues in The Last Alchemist, Part 4, The Council's Shadow.